The season of Christmas shopping is upon us. My idea of hell on earth. Fortunately, in London, you are never far from a pub. So that's the theme of today's videos. It's pubs wherein you can escape the madness of Christmas shopping. Cheek by jowl with Oxford Circus Station, we have our first pub on today's tour, the Argyll Arms. Cheers from the Argyll Arms. This pub probably dates back to the mid-1700s, 1740s possibly, which is roughly coinciding with the date that this street that it's on, Argyll Street, was laid out. This was formerly the site of Argyll House and the London home of the Dukes of Argyll. The second Duke of Argyll, John Campbell, was an important figure in the Act of Union in 1707 and also led the British forces against the Jacobite rebellion at the Battle of Sheriff Muir in 1715. The building is both listed, so we have details to read from Historic England, and it's on camera's inventory of historic pub interiors. Pevsner, also, who is often quite scathing, particularly about pubs, describes this as the best remaining interior of the late 19th century type, with separate bars divided by internal screens, installed around 1895 by R. Sawyer, a maze of mahogany and engraved mirrors under a lincrusta ceiling. Ted Brunning has a particularly flowery bit of prose for describing the interior of the Argyll Arms in his book. He says, classical and floral motifs writhe in luxuriant profusion over vast surfaces in a breathtaking display of bravura. One of the first areas of the pub you might see, depending on which entrance you used to go in, there are two entrances at the exterior, is the corridor. Now, the corridor is actually quite important because this is one of those pubs that retains its late Victorian partitions. So there are at least 4 or 5 distinct drinking areas on the ground floor. However, the frontage of the pub is relatively narrow, sort of a long, thin pub, and there's no way that they could provide 5 separate doors to provide access to those 5 separate drinking areas from the exterior. So the corridor is a solution to facilitate that. The corridor is in itself a very ornate piece of the pub. It has beautiful etched glass mirrors and screens, and also a terrazzo floor, very fine pieced mosaic style flooring. There's a total of 3 snugs inside. It's a little bit difficult to film inside those, unfortunately, because they're naturally, as you'd expect, the first space of the pub to fill up, and it only takes 2 people and suddenly you feel like you're in the way trying to point a camera in there. The bar back is also purportedly original. It has a sort of curved and carved pediment at the top. There's so much to take in at eye height that you may forget to look up, but it also has this very impressive deep red lincrusta ceiling, and that design extends down to the frieze area below the ceiling as well, and also one of the columns has a similar coating. Now then, granite fans will be delighted with the exterior. We have yet more of that wonderful Scandinavian granite. I should issue a correction here. In previous videos, I've been referring to that Norwegian black granite as Larkivite. It is in fact Larvikite. It comes from the town of Larvik in Norway. So this is Larvikite. Ruth Siddall at UCL lists this as Emerald Pearl Larvikite and Vanivek granite, which is from Sweden. So the black stuff is Norwegian, it's Emerald Pearl, and the red stuff is Swedish. There is also an upstairs dining room, not quite as ornate as the ground floor as is typically the case, but it does at least have quite an impressive marble fireplace with mahogany carvings above it, and camera at least believe that may well be original with that 1895 refit. It is a Nicholson's pub today. I believe it has been for some time, possibly going back to the 1980s. A lot of beer was off on this visit, so perhaps not the best moment in time to evaluate the pump offering. I went for just boring old London Pride, came in at £3.25 for a half. It's not actually in great condition either, to be honest, but it's all right, it's drinkable. Next on today's tour of Christmas shopping, avoiding pubs, the Clachan. Cheers from the Clachan. We're on Kingly Street now, which was originally named just King Street, and this pub may be of a similar, or a pub on this site may be of a similar age to the Argyll Arms, possibly mid-1700s again, and that's sort of roughly consistent with when this street was laid out. It's more 1720s. I think the current building dates to 1898. That's the date displayed on the corner of the building, architect unknown, and it was around that time that the pub changed its name to the Clachan. Nobody seems to know why it's called that. As you may have guessed from the sound of the word, it's a Scottish word, a Gaelic word, and it means hamlet or possibly stone. There have been other pubs in London at various times with the same name. The one in the city was renowned for selling whiskies, and they obviously wanted some Scottish sounding name to convey that to its clientele. So I wonder if possibly in its early days the Clachan here on Argyll Street may have also specialised in whiskey. We don't seem to have any particular records to prove that one way or the other. More granite on the exterior, you'll be delighted to hear, and Ruth Siddall identifies this as Marina Pearl Larvikite. Camera's pub heritage site describe it as a striking, loosely French Renaissance style pub. Pevsner a little bit more sniffy about it, who described it as vulgar and prosperous and said pretty much nothing else about it. Possibly its most notable and ostentatious feature is the projecting corner turret. I somehow suspect that was a particular thing that Pevsner hated. Camera on their pub heritage site give it a 1-star rating. I don't think this is quite as immaculate or as well preserved as the Argyll Arms, but there are some interesting features. Camera note that all 3 entrances have mosaic tiled flooring around the entrance. I could only see one of those uncovered and still extant today. It may just be that the other 2 have carpets and are on the inside. Some of the bar back dates back to that 1890s rebuild, and it's quite impressive mahogany work. You actually see that better from the back side of the bar, which is mostly a glass collection area today. There's a lot of additional modern materials seems to have been integrated towards the front side of the bar back, if that makes sense. Also, I think a slightly unfortunate gantry that has glazed panels. That's clearly more modern. You can tell from the quality of the woodwork there and the quality of the glazing. I think that looks a little bit out of place, but I suspect that's a sort of tip of the hat to snob screens, perhaps. Once again, we have a Lincruster ceiling, as we saw at the Argyll Arms. Again though, somehow it's just not really speaking to me in quite the same way. One other feature of note is the raised snug right at the back of the pub. The earliest record I could find of the pub with this name was from 1897, where both the proprietor and the manager of the pub were prosecuted and fined for having what essentially sounded to amount to a Christmas raffle. Also worth noting that this is very close to Liberty. I can practically reach out and touch part of Liberty, and in fact the pub was owned and originally intended to be part of the Liberty complex. I think actually meant to be a warehouse at one point, but then eventually Liberty realised that running a pub was possibly not part of one of their core competencies, so they sold it on to the company that eventually became Nicholson's, or the branding that eventually became Nicholson's, either in the 1980s or 1990s. I see conflicting accounts when exactly that was. As a Nicholson's pub today has a familiar lineup, including Landlord, which I went for a half of. Came in at a slightly eye-watering £3.65, which I assume means a pint is now north of £7. Landlord is always one of the more expensive beers when it's in a lineup, but north of £7, we're definitely in tourist territory here. Next, the Shakespeare's Head, which is from the Shakespeare's Head. This pub is not listed and also does not feature on camera's inventory of historic pub interiors. It probably isn't particularly noteworthy historically either, but I include this partly for 2 reasons. First of all, I think this may be the first pub I ever came to in London as a teenager. I've got a feeling I came here when I knew nothing of London pub history, and we just randomly walked around like tourists and went into this pub, quite possibly getting on for 30 years ago now. The other reason for including it is I think it says something about this area around Carnaby Street, Argyll Street, and backing on to Liberty, has this running theme of mock Tudor, and that's something that you see in Liberty itself. It's a very fine example of 1920s. The current building, the department store had pre-existed that, but the current building of Liberty we see today is a fine example of 1920s Tudor with that sort of half timbering and everything. Now this building is not half timbered, but it still does have sort of Tudor style brickwork and inlays around the windows. Pevsner himself described this building as Tudor-ish, which is I think a fascinatingly non-expert piece of language. And others have commented that it has some sort of Elizabethan air to it, the building of Shakespeare's Head. 1928, and built by an architect called Gordon George McFarlane, who was the chief architect for Watney Combe Reed. There is this rather charming bust, as Pevsner also notices, at the corner of the building that appears to show Shakespeare peering out from a window, and it's oft commented that it's missing a hand, which was possibly due to wartime bomb damage. As I said, the pub is not listed, but Historic England have at least investigated it in a publication about interwar year pub buildings. Inside, there's not much dating back to that 1920s rebuild on the ground floor, possibly a little bit around the edges, but you can see a tiny bit more of that. For once we have a slightly better looking first floor room, usually the other way around in pubs, where some of the wood panelling, some of the freezers, and one or possibly two of the fireplaces appear to date from that 1928 build. It's a Green King pub today. I'm having half of their London Glory, is it? I'll put the surprisingly they didn't have an eponymous. There's a sort of pub where you can imagine they'd have a Shakespeare's Head Ale, which as always would have been one of their other beers rebadged for the purpose of the pub. Next, the Red Lion on Kingly Street. Cheers from the Red Lion. I've just been doing a tour of the interior. It is absolutely beautiful today. It's really quiet. It's hardly anyone there. There's no pipe music, which is a wonderful thing about all Sam Smith's pubs. There was this wonderful waft of open fire. I don't think the fire's lit right now, but it's still sort of lingering from when it was lit yesterday. And it's kind of magical in there. The oldest record I was able to find were, once again, relying on those Sun Fire Office insurance records from the London Metropolitan Archives. Found records going back to about the 1780s of a pub on this site called the Red Lion. For most of its history, it has kind of been called the Red Lion, and we'll get onto that in a moment. Most pubs that I encounter seem to have had sort of various different names throughout their lifespan. I couldn't find any records that pin down the date of the current building. So Kingly Street, some of the structure is 1720, some of the buildings are 1720s, and I think if we look at number 19 a few doors down on Kingly Street, there's a good example of this sort of style of plain, elegant Georgian architecture you would have found on Kingly Street in the 1720s. Everything on this street has been embellished, and it's a real mixed bag. We have a late Victorian building right next door to the Red Lion, but I think the current frontage at least is probably 1920s, and I think it ties in with this theme we've seen in all of this area around Carnaby Street and Kingly Street that is most exemplified by Liberty, of essentially mock Tudor revival. It has something about the brickwork and the way those oriel windows from the first floor up project from a sort of recess. It reminds me of Elizabethan, particularly brick buildings. So I think this is a 1920s tip of the hat nod, whatever you call it, to that style of architecture, very much mock Tudor. It could be that some of the more invisible fabric of the building actually does go all the way back to the 1720s, impossible to tell. The London Picture Archive has photos, one from 1975 and one from 1960. I wish I could show those on screen, they're sort of heavily copyrighted. They show the frontage at that time looking roughly the same as it is today. I'll put links to them in the description, because I think you should really take a look at those. Both the 1960s and 1970s photos, this is not branded as the Red Lion, it's branded as either Henneke's Wine Bar, Henneke's Wine House, or Henneke's Inns. I've encountered that name before. I was familiar with it from the City of York. This was a one-time name of the City of York in High Holborn that I featured in another video. But it turns out Henneke's was in fact the first pub chain, long before we had Wetherspoons or the unstoppable spread of Green King and Nicholson's and the like. There is a great article about the history of the Henneke's brand, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Very, very detailed. But this is a pub chain that goes back to the Victorian era. and already by the 1930s I think their pubs in London ran into double figures. So for quite a long point of its history, I think at least from the 1930s until the 1970s, this pub would have at least externally been branded as Henniky's Winehouse or Henniky's Inn. I think what's striking about the frontage today is the lack of branding. There's nothing above the cornice here. On the ground floor level, when this was a Henniky's house, there were large, you know, rather sort of unpleasant looking signs that actually partly obscured the first floor window announcing the Henniky's branding. But today there's just a simple hanging sign saying Red Lion, nothing above the cornice. There's no long horizontal sign across the whole frontage of the pub. And that's a very rare thing in London. How often do you see a pub that doesn't have at least the name of the pub splashed all the way across the frontage in a big horizontal sign? It's hard to date the interior. Certainly I doubt any of it's older than the 1920s. And we saw the City of York, Henniky's sort of flagship pub, Henniky's Long Bar as it was called at one point in time, was extensively redeveloped in the 1920s, and that gave it that sort of grand baronial style that we see today. So it could well be that around about the same time Henniky's also overhauled the interior here when the frontage was also changed, or possibly the entire building was rebuilt. It does have a fantastic feel to it. It's got wood paneling throughout. There are fireplaces which are actually in use, and it's so quiet and so sort of subtly, wonderfully unbranded that there's so little clutter inside. It's just sort of pure pub magic, in my opinion. And got to take my hat off to Sam Smiths for sort of keeping it pure like that. The fifth and final instalment of today's tour, the Old Coffee House. Cheers with an empty hand from the Old Coffee House. It didn't seem to me as though they had any outside drinking space, and I didn't want to ruin the very nice atmosphere in there by talking to my imaginary friends in the box like an idiot. This pub quite possibly dates to the 1770s, and as the name suggests, was indeed at one time a coffee house. It may previously have been named the Silver Street Coffee House. Pevsner mentions it in passing on his survey of what is now Beak Street. The ground floor was embellished in 1894 by M.T. Saunders. Once again, we have Ruth Siddall to thank for the granite identification. This is Peterhead granite, and it comes from Aberdeenshire. Other attractive sort of pinky sort of hue to it, I think. Prior to the 1890s, it's unclear whether it functioned more as a pub or more as a coffee house in the literal sense from the 1890s onwards. For at least some period of time, not exactly sure how long, it did become a temperance tavern. These places are really quite interesting, as Ted Bruning writes, that not only do they serve the obvious alternatives like coffee in this case and tea, but also alcohol substitutes already existed in the Victorian era. There was a product called Anti-Burton Ale, which is a fascinating name when you consider that the temperance movement presumably had its roots in Christianity, and it has this sort of strange ring of Antichrist to it. And also a product called Winterine, which was declared as being the best possible substitute for brandy. Inside today, Ted Bruning describes it as the original bric-a-brac pub. Has everything from a hot towel dispenser from an Edwardian barbershop to a guitar and all photos signed by the glam rock band, is that the right word, Kiss? Photos of celebrities who may or may not have visited the pub at some point in time. Fishing trophies, you know, there's sort of stuffed fish, other stuffed animals, copper pans hanging from the ceiling. There's also a collection of wartime posters, sort of enlistment and recruitment posters from, I think, World War II, one end of the pub. Some nice brewery livery, some etched mirrors from various different breweries. So it's a real, it's the sort of pub that you could sit in for hours and happily stare at all the things hanging from the walls. It's also unique and interesting for being possibly the only London pub owned by Brodie's Brewery, which is a small brewery based in East London. Just 2 of their beers on tap today, but I think they often have a larger selection than that. I went for the what's it called, Bethnal Green Bitter, which was surprisingly malty, and I quite enjoyed that. Okay, well that's it for today. Hope that's been an interesting and or informative tour of pubs in an area you could either describe as the western reaches of Soho or the area around Carnaby Street. I think it's quite a good cluster of pubs actually. I think the obviously in places you have to accept the reality that it can be a bit overrun by tourists, but the Red Lion today I think showed fantastically. The Red Lion on Kingly Street was an absolute thing of joy to behold, despite some of the other pubs being pretty busy. That was quiet and a fantastic escape from Christmas shopping, if that's what you're trying to get away from. Someone else doing a video over there, I'll leave them to it. So thank you very much for watching, hope that's been useful, and I'll see you on the next one.